For more than 50 years, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were seen as Hollywood's ideal love story, enduring, devoted, and seemingly flawless. Yet behind that polished image, few ever suspected an unsettling truth. Paul Newman appeared to have everything: striking looks, extraordinary talent, and a marriage admired by the public. But even as he rose to become one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, Newman was quietly living a double life, filled with inner conflict and hidden scandal. Born in 1925 in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, Paul Leonard Newman entered the world with piercing blue eyes that would later become legendary. But behind those baby blues was a boy far more drawn to mischief than manners, armed with a charm that could talk him out of almost any trouble he created. Hollywood didn't yet know his name, but trouble certainly did. Considering the golden leading man Newman would eventually become, it's hard to imagine him as anything else. Yet later in life, he looked back on his teenage years with sharp honesty, admitting he wasn't naturally gifted at anything. He wasn't a born lover. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't exceptional. And it was that sense of uncertainty, of not quite fitting anywhere, that quietly shaped both the brilliance of his rise and the darkness that followed. "I wasn't a student. I wasn't a leader." Those were Paul Newman's own words when reflecting on his early years. But stepping beyond that narrow self-image would change everything. His first taste of acting came shockingly early, at just 7 years old, playing a tiny court jester in a local production of Robin Hood. From there, the stage slowly became familiar territory. He performed at the Cleveland Playhouse, joined its children's theater troupe, and by the time he graduated high school in 1943, the pull toward performance was already quietly set. Soon after, he enrolled at Ohio University, unsure of where the road would lead. Then history intervened. With World War II raging, Newman made a decision that could have cost him his life. He joined the U.S. Navy, determined to become a pilot. The official story claimed he was grounded due to color blindness, but that wasn't the truth. Years later, Newman admitted it himself. He simply couldn't handle the complex mathematics required to fly. The dream of the cockpit ended almost as soon as it began. Yet failure redirected him rather than stopping him. Newman was reassigned as a radioman gunner, a role that placed him in constant danger. In 1945, fate came terrifyingly close. Without knowing it at the time, his unit had been scheduled for assignment to the aircraft carrier Bunker Hill, a ship that would soon be devastated in a deadly attack. At the last moment, an unexpected twist intervened. Newman's pilot developed a severe ear infection and was grounded. That single stroke of chance kept Paul Newman off a ship doomed for disaster, and quietly spared the life of a man who had no idea how close he'd come to never returning home. And so, Newman and his crew were forced to remain behind. Just days later, the aircraft carrier Bunker Hill was struck by a devastating kamikaze attack that killed hundreds. Had it not been for something as ordinary as an earache, Paul Newman could easily have been among the dead. He survived the war, and he didn't waste the second chance fate had given him. After World War II, Newman pursued his education, graduating from Kenyon College in 1949 with degrees in drama and economics. He then took to the road with summer stock theater companies like the Belfry and Woodstock Players, honing his craft on small stages. A year at the Yale School of Drama followed, before he moved on to New York City to study under the legendary Lee Strasberg. As he worked to master his art, Newman was about to cross paths with someone else chasing the same dream. At Yale, he met his first wife, Jackie Witt. They married young in 1949, but difficulties surfaced almost immediately. In 1953, Newman landed on Broadway in Picnic, and during this production, one of Hollywood's greatest love stories quietly began, though he may not have realized it at the time. When Paul Newman met Joanne Woodward, he was looking at the woman who would become the love of his life. Yet despite how famous their romance would become, sparks didn't fly right away. When Woodward first saw Newman, she wasn't exactly swept off her feet. Yes, he was handsome, but in a polished, commercial kind of way. She later joked, he looked like an ice cream soda ad. With his impeccable manners and carefully groomed charm, he seemed almost too conventional to leave a lasting first impression. Fireworks? Not yet, but the slow burn had already begun. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward may have been destined for each other, but their love story was anything but clean. The timing was disastrous. Newman was still married to Jackie Witt, with 2 young children waiting for him at home. When the attraction crossed a line, secrecy became his only option, turning what felt inevitable into something forbidden. That secrecy weighed heavily on him. Behind the flawless public image, Newman lived a double life with Woodward for 5 exhausting years, all while the threat of divorce loomed constantly overhead. Looking back, he would later describe those years bluntly, impossible times. I was a failure as an adulterer. Yet even then, desire proved stronger than guilt, and the affair continued despite the damage it caused. The fallout was painful and unavoidable. Newman and Woodward worked together in the long hot summer in 1957, and soon after, he made the decision he could no longer delay. In 1958, he divorced Jackie Witt, but the cost was severe. She later admitted she was consumed by anger and betrayal, feelings that never fully faded. Their children, too, felt the shockwaves of their father's choices, scars that lingered far beyond the headlines. Still, in the immediate aftermath, it was Newman and Woodward who stood in the spotlight, newly married and armed with major Hollywood contracts. If this was a fairy tale, it came with cracks already showing. The romance was real, but the consequences were just as real. While his personal life unraveled off-screen, Newman's career was beginning to take shape. After proving himself on Broadway, he made the leap to film, only to stumble badly out of the gate. His screen debut came in a historical disaster he later called the worst film of the 1950s. Critics mercilessly mocked his toga-clad performance in The Silver Chalice. It was a brutal introduction to Hollywood. But even then, failure was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Even then, no one could deny Paul Newman's presence. Critics may have torn apart The Silver Chalice, but they couldn't overlook his natural magnetism. Comparisons to Marlon Brando began to surface, minus the heavy brooding and chaos. The film may have failed, yet Newman didn't. Audiences sensed something real, and Hollywood did too. Directors quickly realized he was more than a man in sandals reciting lines from ancient scrolls, and they offered him a second chance. That chance arrived at exactly the right moment. After the tragic death of James Dean, Newman stepped into the lead role of Somebody Up There Likes Me in 1956. His explosive, unfiltered portrayal of boxer Rocky Graziano didn't just rescue his career, it redefined it. The performance crackled with authenticity and would go on to inspire future generations of actors, from Stallone onward. And still, this was only the beginning. In 1958, the same year he married Joanne Woodward, Newman starred in Cat on a hot tin roof opposite the mesmerizing Elizabeth Taylor. The film was a massive success and earned him his first Academy Award nomination. From the outside, it looked like everything was falling perfectly into place. Career momentum. A new marriage. Hollywood acclaim. But beneath the surface, tensions were quietly building. What many didn't realize was that Joanne Woodward had reached fame faster than Newman ever did. In 1957, at just 27 years old, she won the Oscar for Best Actress for The Three Faces of Eve. Industry insiders were convinced she was destined to become the next great star. But life had other plans. In 1959, Newman and Woodward welcomed their first child, and everything shifted. Joanne began placing motherhood above ambition, reportedly overwhelmed by guilt whenever work pulled her away from her children. She embraced the role fully, but it came at a cost. While Woodward stepped back to raise their family, Paul Newman's career surged forward at full speed. As his star rose higher and higher, hers slowly faded into the background, setting the stage for a quiet imbalance that would shape their marriage for years to come. That sacrifice left scars that never fully healed. Years later, Joanne Woodward spoke candidly about what happened to her career after marrying Paul Newman, and her words were strikingly painful. She admitted that while she deeply loved her children, if she could live her life over again, she might not have chosen motherhood at all. "Actors don't make good parents," she said bluntly. It was a hard truth Newman wrestled with for decades, even as he worked tirelessly to hide it behind carefully crafted images and reassuring public smiles. To the world, Paul Newman remained Hollywood's blue-eyed ideal, loyal, devoted, and endlessly romantic toward Joanne. Yet one of his most famous remarks reveals a deeper tension. When Playboy once asked how he managed to stay faithful, Newman famously replied, "Why go out for a hamburger when you have steak at home?" The line became legendary, quoted as proof of his devotion. But behind closed doors, Woodward hated it. She later admitted the comment made her feel objectified, like a commodity rather than a partner. Just hearing the quote repeated publicly was enough to make her feel sick. Still, that resentment was only one thread in a much larger knot. Newman carried a quiet guilt over raising two very different families. His 3 children from his first marriage grew up with far less, while his daughters with Woodward were raised in the comfort of a Beverly Hills mansion. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and it haunted him. Woodward tried to soften the divide, but Newman was always aware of the imbalance, and some regrets simply never left. Together, Newman and Woodward didn't just maintain a marriage, they navigated the complicated reality of a blended family under constant public scrutiny. With 3 daughters together and 3 children from Newman's first marriage, their household was crowded with love, tension, noise, and inevitable growing pains. It was a life far messier than the fairy tale Hollywood liked to sell, and far more human than most people ever knew. Yet the darkest shadows in Paul Newman's home life came not from fame or family tension, but from the habits he kept hidden. For years, he quietly battled a severe drinking problem. Those close to him later revealed that he could go through an entire case of beer in a single day, often finishing it off with scotch. At times, he drank until he collapsed. The damage wasn't subtle, it rippled through the household, slowly draining the emotional strength of everyone around him. Joanne Woodward would later describe his alcoholism as the anguish of our lives. Beneath the charm and confidence the world adored, there was a private war that nearly tore their family apart. Woodward had been aware of his drinking from the very beginning, believing it was his way of numbing pain and searching for a moment of calm. Yet despite how deeply rooted the problem was, Newman became remarkably skilled at hiding it. He remained a high-functioning alcoholic, never allowing it to derail his career or tarnish his carefully maintained public image. Keeping that facade intact wasn't always easy. According to his daughter, Newman developed a ritual to force himself upright before facing a day of work. He would fill the sink with ice-cold water and plunge his face into it, shocking his body awake, especially if alcohol was still running through his veins. It worked, at least on the surface. But eventually, the illusion cracked. One night, Woodward discovered Newman in a terrifying state. He had drunk so heavily that he fell out of bed, hitting his head. She found him sprawled on the floor, injured and unresponsive. That moment became her breaking point. Without hesitation, she gathered their 3 daughters, put them in the car, and drove to their beach house in Malibu, fully prepared to leave him for good. She was closer than ever to walking away. But Paul Newman refused to let his family disappear without a fight. Desperate and afraid of losing everything, he got in his own car and followed them, knowing this time the future of his marriage truly hung in the balance. When Newman finally reached the beach house, desperation took over. He pleaded to be let inside, pounding on the door, begging for another chance. This time, Joanne didn't give in. She stood her ground and made him face the consequences. For days, the celebrated movie star was locked out, forced to sleep in his car outside. Years later, Woodward would quietly admit this wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one of many painful scenes they endured behind closed doors. Eventually, they found a way to move forward. The public never saw moments like these, and the couple worked hard to keep their private turmoil hidden. But soon, a different kind of storm began to gather. Tabloids started whispering about cracks in Hollywood's most admired marriage. The rumors claimed that while filming Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, Newman had carried on an affair with a woman named Nancy Bacon. Bacon, a journalist, was allegedly involved with Newman for nearly a year and a half. When word of the relationship began to spread, insiders said Newman and Woodward placed an advertisement in the Los Angeles Times in an attempt to shut the story down. But the effort backfired. Bacon refused to stay silent and later described her relationship with Newman as the worst-kept secret in Hollywood, reigniting speculation and doubt around the couple's carefully protected image. Yet of all his struggles, nothing weighed heavier on Paul Newman than his role as a father. In later years, he admitted he was never truly ready for parenthood and had entered it largely because it was expected of him. He judged himself harshly, once telling a former teacher, "I would not want to have been one of my children." Newman feared he had failed to truly connect with his kids, a regret that lingered far longer than any scandal or headline ever could. For a man who could disappear into the most complicated characters, fatherhood remained the role Paul Newman never felt prepared to play. And then came the kind of tragedy no parent ever recovers from. His eldest son, Scott, who looked uncannily like him, grew up in the shadow of one of Hollywood's greatest icons. But being the son of a legend didn't make life easier. In many ways, it made it harder. Scott refused to trade on his father's name. He rejected shortcuts and handouts, insisting that if he succeeded, it would be on his own terms. "I'm not taking any acting help from my father," he once said. "I want my work to stand on its own merit." Still, the constant comparisons were relentless. Hollywood wanted him to be Paul Newman all over again, an impossible standard that slowly wore him down. At one point, Scott confided to a family friend words that revealed how deeply the pressure cut. "I'm Paul Newman Jr., you know what I mean? But I don't have his blue eyes. I don't have his talent. I don't have his luck. I don't have anything. That's me." That sense of inadequacy followed him everywhere. And like his father, Scott eventually turned to alcohol to numb the frustration and self-doubt. Trouble escalated quickly. There were run-ins with the law, and then, in 1978, a motorcycle accident changed everything. Struggling with pain and emotional turmoil, Scott began relying on prescription painkillers. In November of that year, he mixed a lethal combination of substances. The outcome was devastating. On November 19, 1978, 28-year-old Scott Newman accidentally overdosed and died the following day. For Paul Newman, the loss was unbearable. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the guilt. "There's nothing you can say that will repair my guilt about Scott," he later admitted. "It will be with me as long as I live." In the aftermath, Newman was left carrying emotions no role, no award, and no public admiration could ever ease, a father haunted by love, regret, and a pain that never truly faded. In one of his most painful admissions, Paul Newman confessed, "Many times, I have gotten down on my knees and asked for Scott's forgiveness." The question of what he might have done differently never left him. He searched his memories endlessly, wondering how his son's fate could have been changed. Yet even in that deepest grief, Newman refused to surrender to despair. Instead, he looked forward. Out of loss, he chose purpose, determined that Scott's death would not be meaningless. In 1980, he founded the Scott Newman Center, dedicating it to educating young people about the dangers of alcohol and substance abuse. What began as a mission of awareness grew into something larger, eventually leading to the creation of Rowdy Ridge Gang Camp, a place designed to support families living with the consequences of addiction. And despite the emotional turbulence that marked his private life, Paul Newman's professional momentum never truly slowed. For those who want early access to new videos, priority replies, and a voice in shaping future content, becoming a Fact 8 member offers exactly that. Your support helps sustain the channel. Details are available through the link in the description. Strikingly, the same years filled with turmoil also produced some of Newman's most enduring work. With his easy grin, dark sunglasses, and quiet defiance, his performance in Cool Hand Luke, 1967, earned an Academy Award nomination and secured his place in cultural history. Then, just as his star seemed impossible to dim, he joined forces with Robert Redford. Their pairing in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, ignited the screen and created one of cinema's most beloved partnerships. That magic wasn't accidental. Their real-life friendship carried into their performances, and when they reunited in The Sting, 1973, it confirmed what audiences already knew. The film won 7 Oscars, blending sharp intelligence with pure entertainment, and cemented their legendary chemistry. With every role, Newman pushed further, breathing life into outlaws and underdogs, giving them weight, humanity, and a charisma that never faded. Decades after The Hustler, Paul Newman stepped back into the role of Fast Eddie Felson in 1986's The Color of Money, and this time the Academy could no longer deny him. The long-awaited Oscar finally arrived. But that win didn't mark a victory lap. Newman kept pushing forward, delivering powerful performances while quietly building a legacy of generosity and purpose. With age came depth. In The Verdict and Nobody's Fool, he offered some of the most subtle, compelling work of his entire career, performances defined by restraint, gravity, and undeniable presence. In 2002, he stunned audiences once again with Road to Perdition, portraying a mob boss with chilling control and emotional weight, earning yet another Oscar nomination. Time hadn't diminished him, it had sharpened him. And acting, remarkably, was only part of the story. Away from the camera, Newman pursued another passion with the same intensity: auto racing. Beginning in the early 1970s, he competed professionally, determined to be respected not as a movie star dabbling in speed, but as a legitimate racer. At 70 years old, he became the oldest driver to win his class at Daytona. It wasn't a novelty, it was proof. Newman went on to win 7 SCCA national championships, narrowly missed an overall win at Le Mans in 1979, and claimed Trans Am victories in 1982 and 1986. His final triumph came at Lime Rock, a fitting place to close the circle. In 2007, at 82 years old, Paul Newman won his last race. Legend status, undeniable. But fate had one final, cruel turn. In 2008, Newman was forced to step away from directing the stage production of Mice and Men due to health concerns.